This is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church in the community of Tull outside Benton, with your devotion taken from the book of Deuteronomy chapter 32, beginning with verse 23 and going through the end of the chapter. Moses reminds them, beginning in verse 23, and gives them a motivation of why they should not go after false gods. He gives them a long list between verse 23 and verse 30 of some of the things that they will experience as a result of going after false gods, and he does this as a source of motivation to prevent them or to give them pause as to why they should not think about betraying God and going after the false gods of this world. He says that they will experience calamities, that they will experience disasters, that they will experience destruction, and also that the judgment that will come upon them will not be impartial, that all those that are numbered among the nation of Israel will suffer because of those that lead others astray to worshiping false gods. He tells them that they will be taunted by their enemies and ridiculed by their enemies, and they'll be mocked by their enemies. He tells them that they will be a nation without sense, that they will be a nation that is impractical in their sense of lack of judgment, that they are a nation that will be against all odds, and that they are a nation that will self-destruct in verses 31 through 33. They will be a nation whose sins will be exposed, and they will be a nation that will experience a high level of insecurity, according to verse 35. That there will be a nation, according to verse 36, that will receive the judgment of God, and that they will be a nation that will be betrayed by the gods that led them away from God, and that as a result of it, they will experience betrayal by those gods in verses 37 through 38. And then in verse 39 through 42, ultimately, they will have to succumb to God's judgment, and they will have to admit before God that they are a defeated people because they followed after false gods. But after the calamity is over, in verse 43, we find that God does not leave them in a state of desperation. God does not leave them as an abandoned child. In reality, when you look at verse 43, we find that he creates a pathway forward where they can experience deliverance, where they can experience avenging their enemies, and where they can experience what it's like to have atonement by God. And whenever it is that we as God's people go off in a pathway of sin, whether it's worshiping false gods that lead us down a pathway of destruction such as is spelled out in verse 23 through 30, or whether it's sins that we bring upon ourselves, the one thing we always need to remember is that there is never a sin that will create such a gap between us and God that God is not able to reach across it and to forgive us and bring us back into his right fellowship. And as we see in verse 43, God is a God who will deliver us even from our own sins. He will avenge those that lead us in the pathway of sin, and he will create a pathway of atonement that we might be righteous in our life again. When God always creates a pathway to reconciliation, it tells us and reminds us, according to verses 46 through 47, what we should do. That we should take these words to heart and apply them personally to our life. That we should not expect those around us to listen while we just choose a pathway of disobedience. That we are to command these things to our children and to teach these things to our children, because the way in which we show love to our children is to warn them that they do not want to go down the paths of mistakes that we have gone down. And we also find that he tells us in verse 46 through 47 that we should obey carefully the things that God has told us, because in obeying the things that God has told us, we won't have to experience the things that we referenced in verses 23 through 30. And finally, he tells us that we should not be idle, and that we need to remember that these words are our life. God is a God of life. He's a God who gives us a pathway to eternal life. He is a God who gives us the ability to live this life in a way that is pleasing to him, that brings peace to ourselves. Moses had concluded this passage or this song by leaving them with words of encouragement. He started off the song by reminding them of the goodness of God, how that he had brought them life, and how he had brought them out of a state of despair, and how he had brought them to a place where that they could be prosperous all their ways. But he also reminded them that if they were not careful, they would be led astray, and he forecasted or gave prophecy that they would turn their back on God in their moment of prosperity and go back after false gods, and that they would reap the punishment as spelled out in verses 23 through 30. But then he also left it on a high note, reminding them that their responsibility were to follow these words and to obey God and to make them part of their daily life. And when we do that, the song that we sing will be a song of joy in our heart.